What's up, audit fans, and welcome to my video on ASA330 about how auditors respond to assess risks. Now, why is this particular standard important? Well, it actually links back to the previous video in the series on 315. Inside 315, it says that the auditor has to identify significant risks. All right, remember, those are the accounts that are more likely to be at risk of misstatement. Now, you might also know our significant risks by the name inherent risks. So those two, I tend to think, are fairly interchangeable. We take a risk-based approach to the audit. So where there is greater risk, I'm going to spend more time. ASA330 says that we need to consider what our responses are to these assessed risks. We can't just have the risks and then not do anything about them. We need to customize our audit appropriately. And that's the key. Customize or adapt or adjust our audit. When we look at the table of contents, we're going to talk about our overall response for the whole audit, looking at specific areas, presentation and disclosure in the financial report. If there is excess risk, often we have to talk about it. We have to look at the sufficiency and appropriateness of evidence, which actually links back to ASA 500 or links forward to ASA 500. And you'll notice here at the very end, documentation. That's always the last component of our auditing standards, because what we have to do is we have to take all of the decisions we're making up here and make sure that we document them appropriately, so that if we're investigated by ASIC or a peer review, or even just the partner wants to check what we're doing, we've got adequate documentation. Now, here we have our conformity section. This is actually a bit of a mistake here, I noticed, in the standard, because it's not ISA 315, it's actually ISA 330. So 330 is exactly the same. They've just got the wrong number there, but it's the auditor's response to assess risk. So everything within the ISA and the ASA are harmonized and aligned. Let's jump into our scope, which is the basic tenant of the particular standard. So it's our responsibility to design and implement responses to the risks of material misstatement. So what does it mean by responses? Responses are really about how we're going to collect our evidence to determine whether there really is a misstatement caused by this risk. Our question is, does the risk result in a material misstatement? And what we have to do is we have to go and collect evidence through designing and implementing audit procedures. So another thing linked to that is going to be that we're going to be looking at designing procedures to determine whether that significant risk does result in an error or whether it's all correct. So that is the purpose of our standard. Jumping into our definitions here, and the first one is substantive procedure. We haven't really got to procedures yet in the series, but I do have plenty of videos on auditing and designing substantive procedures. So they're ways to either test details of individual transactions, balances or disclosures, or substantive analytical procedures. The other type of procedure is tests of internal controls. Now, these two types of procedures are actually linked to the audit strategy that we're going to use. And we have two main types of strategies. We have a strategy based around controls, so a controls-based strategy for the audit. And the other one is a substantive strategy for the audit. And remember that our audit strategy is going to be linked to how we implement the audit risk model. So the audit risk model is detection risk, audit risk, inherent risk, and control risk. So depending on what detection risk we have, then it'll affect our audit strategy and which of these procedures we decide to use, or which combination, because we're usually going to use some form of combination of all of those procedures, will make up our audit program. But check out my videos on audit strategy for some more about these particular areas. So we've just got that particular definition. So what exactly do we have to do? Well, If we look at paragraph 5, I shall design and implement responses to address the risks of material misstatement. So this is, again, the basics are just saying we're going to take our risk-based approach. And where we have risks, I'm going to do something to make sure that I'm gathering evidence. The next paragraph, paragraph 6, is more about specific risks at the assertion level. So remember, we might have risks for an overall company, but then we want to be able to link them to specific accounts and assertions. So when I'm designing my audit procedures, I have to consider the nature, what procedure, when to collect it, which is timing, and extent, which is how much evidence, based on the specific risk. So if a risk is much higher, I'm probably going to want to collect more information in a more thorough way than if the risk is lower. So I have to consider a few things when designing the risk, and that's paragraph 7 here. When I design the procedures, I need to consider, well, why is there the risk? Is it management have an incentive to manipulate something? Is it that something is just generally complicated and risky because of estimation? So I need to think about what is the cause of the inherent risk. And then that will help me determine how I'm going to test or gather my evidence. So I need to think about my evidence. Now, I mentioned earlier that the description talks about tests of controls, and if the company does have good internal controls, so this is a situation where control risk is low or medium, then what I need to do is I need to test the operating effectiveness. So the real question when I'm doing operating effectiveness is I'm asking, do they work? Do the controls do what they're supposed to do to prevent or detect material misstatements? There are also some paragraphs that talk about testing internal controls. So when we're testing internal controls, I want to make sure that the controls were applied at the relevant time periods. So that means that most of the time, were the controls working for the entire year? No good if the control was only working for part of the year. Was it consistently applied? So if a control is a manual process, is it always being done the right way? And then whom or by what means? And a lot of controls these days are IT related, but we may still have some manual ones. So we need to look at the tests of controls. Now, if we scroll down a bit, it talks about the timing of the tests of controls. And realistically, controls happen all year round. So I can't be there to test the controls all year. I have to go back and I need to make sure that I look at evidence to make sure that the controls were being tested. So that could be on a document, somebody's signature. Has that signature been obtained? Now, audits are busy periods. So sometimes you might do part of the work in what they call the interim period. So that is usually 3/4 of the way through the year. We might go and we might do some evidence. For internal controls, for example, let's say this is the entire year. This is sort of the 3/4 mark. I might come in and actually before the end of the year test that all of these internal controls were working. And that means that when I come back over here at the end of the year, I only need to test that particular component. Now, of course, sometimes I might want to use evidence that I had used in a previous year. So if the control has not changed, then I may rely on evidence from a previous year. It's pretty rare that controls will not change because so much of companies is customized and is adapted. So we need to be very careful if we're going to use audit evidence from a previous period. Now, if I do plan to use evidence from a previous period about whether controls are working or not, I need to get evidence about whether significant changes have occurred. So I need to find evidence to say that there has been no change in the internal controls, and then I can rely on the control evidence from previously. Sometimes, though, we can't rely on controls from previous years if the control is about a specific significant risk. I have to make sure I test those every single year. If it's a more general control, again, sometimes there's rotations. So what I've seen quite often is a bit of a 3-year rotation. So as long as the control hasn't changed, you only need to test it every 3rd year, unless the control is about a significant risk. Now, I talked earlier about the operating effectiveness. Really, that's just saying, is the control working? Does it work as it was designed? I mentioned that our other strategy is our substantive approach. And we're always going to have to do some substantive procedures. Even if you do mostly this controls testing thing, we will have to do some substantive testing. And that's borne out here in paragraph 18. Irrespective of the assessed risks, the auditor shall design and perform substantive procedures. So that's always doing some substantive work. Sometimes in the audit world, you might see the phrase CYA. CYA means cover your arse. Right? So that might sound a bit crude, but we do it just in case we might miss something from testing internal controls. The auditor also needs to make sure that we do some substantive procedures about end-of-year processes. So adjusting information, closing off ledgers, creating the financial statements, and also our general substantive procedures in response to a significant risk. So if there is a significant risk, we should perform substantive procedures to respond to that risk. So we might, and I often say this to my students, if you have a risk, you might hypothesize how that might come about. Well, there's a risk of overstatement of sales because of management's incentive or compensation structure based on reaching sales targets. So then I could hypothesize, well, they could create fake sales or fake customers. Then I need to collect substantive evidence to prove that that significant risk has not come to pass. So if I have a list of 7 significant risks, I should have essentially 7 different pools of evidence to prove that those risks have not resulted in a material misstatement. So I've looked at substantive procedures, I've looked at internal controls, but remember the final assertion that we always have is our assertion about presentation and disclosure. So I also need to gather evidence to make sure that everything is being reported in accordance with our financial reporting framework, which is generally our AASBs or our international financial reporting standards. This might be a job that's often done by senior staff who have more expertise in reading and interpreting those standards, or there might even be specialists within your firm who are focused on disclosures. Coming to the end or towards the end, we also have to evaluate the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. This is actually going to link back to ASA ISA330, which says no matter what we're doing, we need to collect sufficient and appropriate evidence. So I need to make some judgments about whether the evidence we've got is sufficient and appropriate. Now, sufficient means the right volume. Okay, so sufficiency is about the correct volume. Appropriate is about, are we using the right procedures to gather that evidence? Are we looking at internal or external evidence? Did we gather it ourselves? Did our client gather it for us? So I must collect sufficient and appropriate evidence. However, there are no hard and fast rules. Again, this is an area open to very broad auditor judgment. If I can't get sufficient and appropriate evidence, then I have the options to go with a qualified audit opinion or a disclaimer of opinion under ASA ISA 706. We do our best to try and find evidence, but sometimes if we can't, that's going to be a problem. I'll link to a video that goes through the different types of audit opinions. Our very final area within the standard is, of course, the one I always do and I've been doing in pink, is our documentation. So what do I need to include? My responses to my risks. So if I have my risk, all right, so essentially I'll have my risk, and then next to that, I'll have my plan. What am I going to do to gather evidence to find out if that risk actually resulted in a misstatement? So that's the risks and the linkage of the procedures. That's sort of the plan, and then the results. So I've got my plan, and then that will help me generate my actual audit evidence. As always, the explanatory material is yours to go over. If you have any questions about the standard on our responses to our assessed risks, our significant and inherent risks, please pop them in the comments below. If you thought the video was useful, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing to get more audit videos.